The office building stood tall in the middle of the city, glowing with lights from the top floors, while the streets below were quiet and still, and every night, when the busy workers left with tired smiles or hurried steps, there was one man who stayed behind, moving slowly and silently through the halls, with a mop in his hand and a bucket of water at his side, and this man was Mr. Lee, the silent janitor. No one really knew much about Mr. Lee, and that was part of what made him so mysterious, because in a place where everyone liked to talk and share news about their lives, he never said more than a few short words, and when someone asked him how he was, he would simply nod with a small polite smile and keep walking, and some of the younger employees even joked that he was like a ghost, because he could pass by without anyone noticing until he was already gone. The CEO of the company, Mr. Grant, had seen Mr. Lee many times before in passing, but never thought much about him at first, because there were many staff members in the building, and he was always busy with meetings, deadlines, and phone calls. But lately something had started to catch his attention, because he noticed that Mr. Lee always left at exactly the same time every night, 10 o'clock sharp, never earlier, never later, and it was always in the same quiet, careful way, as if he was trying not to be noticed at all. One evening, Mr. Grant was working late alone in his office, and the floor was silent except for the soft swish of the mop somewhere down the hall. And when he stepped out to get some water, he saw Mr. Lee standing near the large window, looking out at the city lights, with a faraway look in his eyes. And in that moment something about the man seemed heavy, almost like he was carrying a weight that no one else could see. And before Mr. Grant could say anything, Mr. Lee quickly turned back to his work without a word. From that night on, Mr. Grant began to pay closer attention, and he saw small details that he had never noticed before, like the way Mr. Lee's hands trembled slightly when he picked up the mop, or the way he avoided meeting anyone's eyes for more than a second, and sometimes when he thought no one was watching, Mr. Lee would stop and take a deep breath, as if holding back a feeling that was too strong to let out. The mystery began to grow in Mr. Grant's mind, and he started wondering why a man like this would choose to be a janitor in such a big company, especially since Mr. Lee carried himself with a certain quiet grace that did not match the usual image of someone in his position, and there was also a strange air of sadness about him, one that made Mr. Grant feel a mix of curiosity and something else he could not name. One night, as Mr. Grant packed up his papers, he saw Mr. Lee in the hallway again, and for just a moment their eyes met, and Mr. Grant felt a sharp pull in his chest, because those eyes were not empty, they were full of something deep and unspoken, something that told a story, without using a single word. And then just like that, Mr. Lee looked away, and kept moving his mop back and forth in slow, steady strokes. From that point, Mr. Grant could not let it go. He started thinking about Mr. Lee during meetings, while driving home, even while trying to sleep at night, and he began to imagine different stories about the man. Perhaps he had once been someone important who had lost everything, or maybe he was hiding from someone or something. And the more he thought, the more the questions grew, until he felt a strong need to find out the truth. The building had security cameras in the hallways, but that felt too cold and distant for what Mr. Grant wanted to know. He needed to see with his own eyes where Mr. Lee went after work, and why he always left so precisely at 10 o'clock without speaking to anyone. So one Thursday night, Mr. Grant decided he would follow him quietly and carefully and try to uncover the secret that had been living in his building all along. That night the office was quiet as usual, and the city outside was covered in the glow of streetlights. Mr. Grant waited in his office, pretending to work, while watching the clock tick closer to 10, and he could hear the soft, familiar sound of the mop moving back and forth down the hall. Then, at exactly 10, Mr. Lee placed the mop in the corner, emptied the bucket of water, and picked up his small worn bag, slinging it over his shoulder without looking around. Mr. Grant waited a few moments before stepping out into the hallway, and keeping a safe distance behind Mr. Lee. As he walked toward the elevator, the air felt different, somehow heavier, as if the walls themselves knew that something important was about to happen. And when the elevator doors opened, Mr. Lee stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor, his face calm but unreadable. When the doors closed behind them, Mr. Grant stood to the side, pretending not to notice him, but inside his heart was beating faster than it ever had during any business deal. And he knew deep down that whatever he was about to learn about the silent janitor would not be something he could easily forget. The elevator doors slid open with a soft sound, and Mr. Lee stepped out into the empty lobby, his worn shoes making a faint echo across the shiny marble floor, while Mr. Grant kept a short distance behind, his eyes fixed on the quiet figure moving slowly toward the exit. and the air inside the lobby felt cold, like the kind of cold that is not only in the air, but also in the way everything seems still and waiting. And without turning his head, Mr. Lee pushed open the glass door and stepped into the night. Outside, the street was almost silent, with only the faraway hum of traffic and the occasional sound of a car passing by under the pale glow of the streetlights. And Mr. Lee walked with the same slow, careful steps. As he always did, his shoulders slightly bent forward, as if carrying something heavy, though there was nothing in his hands but the small bag he always carried, and behind him at a safe distance, Mr. Grant followed, feeling a strange excitement and nervousness mixed together in his chest. The city looked different at this hour. The bright, busy face it showed during the day was gone, and in its place were long shadows, narrow alleys, and windows with only a few lights still on. And Mr. Lee moved as if he knew exactly where to go without needing to look around, while Mr. Grant did his best to stay close enough not to lose him, but far enough to remain unseen. And with each turn they took, the streets became quieter and darker until the tall office buildings were far behind them. They passed a small bakery with its windows dark and its chairs stacked neatly on tables, a closed newspaper stand with bundles of unread papers tied with string, and a lonely street lamp flickering in and out as if it was struggling to stay alive. And at one point Mr. Lee stopped near a shop window, its glass dusty and its sign faded. And inside the shop Mr. Grant saw flowers, rows and rows of flowers, but not fresh and bright. Instead they were old and dry, hanging upside down as if frozen in time. Mr. Lee stood there for a long moment, his face hidden in shadow, but his body still and silent, and then he lifted one hand to the glass and pressed it gently against the cold surface, his fingers spread as if reaching for something he could not touch. And for a brief second, Mr. Grant thought he saw the faint shine of tears in the corner of the janitor's eyes. But before he could be sure, Mr. Lee turned away and began walking again, his steps a little faster this time. The streets grew narrower and the houses smaller and more worn as they went on, until Mr. Lee stopped again, this time in front of a tiny building with cracked walls and peeling paint, the kind of place most people would walk past without looking twice. And yet there was something about the way Mr. Lee stood there that made the place feel important, almost sacred, and Mr. Grant stayed in the shadow of a nearby tree, his eyes never leaving the older man. Slowly Mr. Lee reached into his bag and took out a small key, and with quiet care he unlocked the door, pushing it open just enough to slip inside, without letting much light escape. And Mr. Grant felt a pull inside him, an urge to go closer, to see what was inside, and to finally understand what it was that made this man so different from anyone else he had ever met. So without making a sound, he stepped closer to the side of the building where a small window stood slightly open, its frame warped from age. Through the gap he could see the dim light of a single lamp casting soft golden shadows across the small room, and on the walls were pictures framed neatly but covered in a thin layer of dust. And Mr. Grant leaned closer, his breath catching, when he saw one photo in particular. It was Mr. Lee, much younger, wearing a suit and tie, standing with a group of important-looking people and shaking hands with someone who appeared to be a high official. And in another photo Mr. Lee was smiling, holding a young boy in his arms, the joy on his face so clear that it almost did not seem like the same man who now worked quietly cleaning floors at night. Inside the room, Mr. Lee sat down at a wooden table and placed the framed picture of the boy in front of him, and he spoke softly, as if talking to someone who was still there. "I miss you, my son," his voice gentle, but filled with a deep ache that seemed to fill the whole room. And in that moment, Mr. Grant felt like he was intruding on something sacred, yet he could not move away, because he knew this was the heart of the mystery he had been chasing. The older man stayed there for a while, his eyes never leaving the picture, before finally leaning back with a heavy sigh and looking toward a small shelf filled with books and papers and a single box tied with a ribbon. And though Mr. Grant could not see what was inside, he knew it must hold something important, something that explained why this man lived the way he did now. And as the quiet stretched on, Mr. Grant realized this was only the beginning, because whatever story lived inside that small house was not only about the past, it was about lost pain and perhaps even redemption. And he knew he would not be able to walk away without learning it all. Mr. Grant stood outside the small worn house, his back pressed against the wall, his breath quiet and careful, while the soft yellow light from inside spilled faintly through the thin curtains and the open window. And even though the air was cool, there was a strange heat rising in his chest, not from the night, but from the mix of curiosity and guilt twisting inside him. And he knew he was standing in a place he had no right to be, yet he also knew he could not turn away. Through the small open gap, he could see Mr. Lee sitting at the table, his shoulders hunched, his hands resting on the wooden surface, as if the weight of the years sat heavy on them. And beside him the photo of the smiling boy stayed in its frame, catching the light from a lamp, and Mr. Lee's eyes kept going back to it, as if it was the only thing in the room that mattered. And Mr. Grant noticed how the man's lips moved slowly, forming words too soft to hear, but carrying a kind of longing that was stronger than any sound. The room itself was small and old, yet every corner seemed to hold a story. There was a cupboard with chipped paint and handles worn smooth by time, and on top of it a few dusty trophies, their gold shine faded. But still proud, there was a shelf lined with books, their spines bent and pages yellow, and on the wall next to the pictures hung a single black coat, clean and neatly pressed, as if waiting for a day that might never come. And all of these details told Mr. Grant that this man had once lived a very different life. Mr. Lee rose from the table and walked to a narrow hallway, his steps slow but steady, and from where he stood Mr. Grant could see him open the door to another room. Inside there was a bed neatly made with a blanket folded perfectly at the edge, and above it another picture hung on the wall, this time of a woman, smiling with the same warmth that the boy's picture carried. And Mr. Lee reached out and touched the frame gently, his fingers brushing over the glass as if touching her face, and his head bowed for a long moment. When he came back into the main room, he carried a small wooden box tied with a faded ribbon, and he set it on the table carefully, as though it was something fragile. Inside the box, Mr. Lee took out a handful of letters, each folded neatly and stacked in perfect order. And though Mr. Grant could not read the words from where he was, he could see how Mr. Lee's eyes softened as he looked at them, his thumb tracing over the handwriting and then placing them back, as if protecting them from the world. There was something in the way Mr. Lee moved, something quiet and deliberate, like a man who had learned to live with memories instead of people. And as Mr. Grant watched, he felt a strange ache in his own chest, because this was no longer just about curiosity. This was about understanding who this man really was, and why he had chosen a life so far from the one he seemed to have before. A sudden sound broke the stillness, a faint creak from under Mr. Grant's foot as he shifted his weight, and for a moment his breath caught in his throat, because Mr. Lee's head turned slightly, his eyes narrowing toward the window. Though he did not rise from his seat, the silence between them stretched thin, like a thread ready to snap, and Mr. Grant pressed himself closer to the wall, praying the shadows would hide him. After a moment, Mr. Lee looked away again, his gaze falling back to the picture of the boy, and he spoke aloud, this time his voice low, but clear enough for Mr. Grant to hear. "I promised I would take care of you. I promised I would always be there. But I failed, and now this is all I can do." And the weight in his voice was so heavy that even the air seemed to grow thicker, and Mr. Grant felt as if he had stepped into a confession not meant for any living ear. Outside the house, the street remained silent, no footsteps, no passing cars, only the faint hum of the city far away. And in that stillness, Mr. Grant felt a shift inside himself. He had followed the man for answers, but now he felt as if he was carrying part of the burden he had just witnessed. And he knew that what he had seen was only a small piece of a much larger story. The clock from a nearby church tower rang 11 soft chimes, drifting through the quiet night, and Mr. Lee stood again, moving slowly toward a small desk in the corner, where a candle flickered, its light dancing against the walls. He opened a drawer and took out an old leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked with age, and began to write, his hand moving steadily across the page, as if the words came from a place deep inside that had been locked for years. Mr. Grant did not know what was written there, but he knew it mattered. He knew it was part of the truth. And as he stepped back into the shadows, he felt a strange pull to come back to this place again, because the silent janitor's lonely house held more than just memories. It held the pieces of a man who had once lived a different life and somehow had ended up here. The night outside the small house felt heavier as Mr. Grant stayed hidden in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the dim light spilling from the window. And inside, Mr. Lee kept writing in the old notebook, his hand steady and calm, as though every word was a piece of himself. And after a while he set the pen down and leaned back in the chair, his gaze drifting once more to the picture of the boy on the table. And the silence that filled the room was not empty. It was full of something deep, something that spoke without sound. Mr. Grant could feel his own heartbeat in his ears as he waited, watching every movement inside. And then Mr. Lee's voice broke the stillness, quiet at first, but carrying a weight that made every word feel heavy. "I thought I could protect them. I thought I could keep them safe, but I was wrong. And as his voice trembled slightly, he reached for the wooden box again, lifting out a small medal on a ribbon, the kind of medal given for service or bravery. And he held it in his hands, turning it slowly, as if the shine held memories that were both beautiful and painful. He spoke again, this time as though telling a story to someone who was no longer there. "You were so proud that day you told me I was your hero, and I believed it. I believed I could be that for you forever." And for a moment his voice caught, and his eyes closed, and Mr. Grant felt something inside him twist, because this was no longer just curiosity. This was witnessing a man pour out the pieces of his heart to ghosts that still lived with him. Mr. Lee rose from the table and moved toward a small cupboard in the corner. And when he opened it, Mr. Grant could see more photographs stacked carefully inside, along with a few documents, and a small flag folded neatly into a triangle, the kind often seen at funerals for soldiers. And beside it was a framed certificate with Mr. Lee's name written across it in bold letters, the words of honor and service clear even from where Mr. Grant stood, and the sight made his mind race with new questions about who this man truly was before he became the silent janitor. Slowly Mr. Lee took one of the photographs from the cupboard and brought it back to the table, and in the soft lamplight Mr. Grant could see it was of Mr. Lee in a military uniform, standing beside a young woman, holding the boy from the other picture, and they were smiling wide as if nothing bad could ever touch them, and the image seemed to hold a frozen moment of pure happiness, a life far from the one Mr. Lee lived now. And for a while he just sat there looking at it, his hand resting gently on the glass. His voice came again, softer now, but still clear. "We had plans, we had a home and dreams, and we thought we had time, but time is cruel, and it takes without warning." And Mr. Grant felt the weight of those words settle over him like a cold blanket, because he could feel that whatever happened next in the story would not be something easy to hear, and yet he could not step away, he could not leave without knowing all of it. The candle on the desk flickered, casting long shadows across the walls, and in that wavering light Mr. Lee's face looked older and more tired, as if each memory was a stone being added to the load he carried. And then he looked toward the window, though his eyes did not seem to see the outside world. They were looking somewhere far away, somewhere only he could go. And he said quietly, "It was an accident, but it was my fault. I should have been there. I should have stopped it." Those words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and lingering, and Mr. Grant felt his own chest tighten, because now the pieces were starting to form a picture, though it was not yet complete, and he needed to know the rest. He needed to understand what had happened to take this man from a proud uniform and a happy family to this lonely life of quiet cleaning and empty nights. Mr. Lee stood again, and this time he moved to the shelf where the old books were stacked and pulled one out, its cover worn and edges frayed, and when he opened it a few loose papers fell to the floor. He picked them up carefully, and Mr. Grant could see they were letters, each one addressed to someone named Daniel, and each one written in the same neat handwriting that filled the notebook. And Mr. Lee placed them back inside the book, holding it close to his chest, as if the words inside were the only thing keeping him standing. For a moment he just stayed there in the middle of the small room, the lamplight wrapping around him like a fragile shield. And then he whispered, "I will keep talking to you until I cannot speak anymore, because if I stop it will be like you never lived, and I cannot let that happen." And his voice broke just slightly before he sat back down at the table, his head bowed over the photo of the boy, and the silence returned heavier than before. Outside the window Mr. Grant stepped back into the shadows, his mind spinning with everything he had just heard and seen. And he knew this was no longer just about finding out who the janitor was. This was about a man who had lost the world he loved and was now living with the pieces. And in that moment Mr. Grant felt something change inside himself, though he did not yet know what it meant. The night air outside the small house was still and heavy as Mr. Grant stood in the shadow of the tree, his mind turning over every word he had just heard, every image he had just seen, and part of him wanted to walk away to give the man his privacy, but another part, a stronger part, knew he had to understand more. And so he stayed there, his eyes fixed on the dim light inside, while the sound of the quiet street filled the space between them. Inside, Mr. Lee was still seated at the table, his head bowed slightly, his hands resting near the framed picture and the wooden box. And he looked so still that for a moment it seemed as if time itself had stopped around him. Then he reached for the notebook again, opening it slowly, as if the pages were something fragile. And as he began to write, Mr. Grant leaned a little closer to the open window, his foot brushing against a small branch on the ground. The sharp crack of the twig echoed louder than it should have in the silent night, and Mr. Grant froze, his breath caught in his throat, his body tense. But inside the room, Mr. Lee's head lifted, his eyes narrowing slightly toward the window, and for a moment the two men stayed perfectly still, separated by only a thin wall and a small open gap. Then Mr. Lee rose from his chair, moving with a slow, deliberate step toward the window, and without thinking, Mr. Grant stepped back, but not fast enough, because their eyes met. For a few long seconds neither of them spoke, and Mr. Grant saw in Mr. Lee's face not anger, but a deep tiredness and a quiet question, as if asking without words, "Why are you here?" And Mr. Lee reached over and pushed the curtain aside, his voice calm. "But lo, Mr. Grant, what are you doing here?" And the CEO's mind raced, searching for an answer that would make sense. But nothing came out, only the truth. "I was curious about you, and I followed you." There was another pause before Mr. Lee opened the front door, his voice steady, but with an edge of something heavier coming. Mr. Grant hesitated for a heartbeat, then stepped forward, crossing the short path to the doorway. And inside, the warmth of the small house hit him, along with the scent of old paper and dust, and something faintly sweet, maybe tea that had been made earlier and forgotten, and he stood there unsure if he should speak or wait. Mr. Lee walked back to the table and sat down, his eyes on the photograph of the boy. He said quietly, "You saw everything, didn't you?" And Mr. Grant nodded slowly, his voice soft. "I saw some things, but I don't understand all of it. I just knew there was more to you than what we see at work, and I want to know why you always seemed so alone." Mr. Lee looked at him for a long moment, his gaze steady and unreadable, before he said, "Sometimes people are alone because that is all they have left." The words hung in the air between them, and Mr. Grant felt their weight more than he could explain. He looked at the pictures on the wall, the trophies, the folded flag, the old medals, and he asked in a quiet voice, "Who was the boy in the photo?" And Mr. Lee's hand rested gently on the frame, his eyes not leaving it. "His name was Daniel." He said, "My son, my only child." And the way he spoke the name made it sound like something precious, something that had been taken too soon. Mr. Grant did not interrupt as Mr. Lee began to speak again, his voice slow and measured like a man walking through a memory. "I served for many years. I wore the uniform with pride, and my family was everything to me. My wife was strong and kind, and my boy was full of life. He loved to run and laugh and tell me I was his hero, and I believed him. But one night there was an accident, a fire at the house. While I was away on duty, I came back too late. The smoke had taken them both, and I never forgave myself." The room felt smaller as the words filled it, and Mr. Grant felt his chest tighten. He had heard many stories in his life, but none that carried this kind of quiet pain, the kind that does not fade with time. Mr. Lee continued, "I could not go back to my old life. I could not stand in the places where they had been. I left everything behind. I found work where no one knew me, where no one asked questions, and I kept my head down because it was easier to live in silence than to speak and feel it all again." For a long moment neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Then Mr. Lee looked up, his eyes meeting Mr. Grant's, and said softly but firmly, "Now you know why I am the way I am and why I live as I do." And there was no challenge in his voice, only a statement of truth and a quiet acceptance of what could not be changed. Mr. Grant felt the urge to say something, to offer comfort, but the words seemed too small for the weight of what he had just heard. So instead he sat there across from the man he had followed through the night, and for the first time he saw not just a janitor, but a father, a soldier, a man carrying a lifetime of love and loss. The small room felt warmer now, but not because of the lamp or the candle. It was because two men sat together in the quiet, and there was no longer a wall of mystery between them. And Mr. Grant kept his eyes on Mr. Lee, seeing not just the sadness in him, but also the strength it took to live with that sadness every single day. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because sometimes silence says more than words ever can. Mr. Lee's hands rested on the wooden table, his fingers lightly touching the edge of the framed photograph of his son, and his gaze was steady, as if he was seeing Daniel's face in his mind, clear and bright as the day the picture was taken. And Mr. Grant felt an ache inside him, a kind of respect he had not expected to feel. And he said quietly, "You have carried this alone for a long time." And Mr. Lee nodded slowly, his voice calm. "Yes, because no one else could carry it for me, and I did not want to put my pain on anyone else." Mr. Grant leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but firm. "You have already carried it for too long, and you do not have to keep it locked inside anymore. You have a story that matters, a life that deserves to be remembered, not just by you, but by others too." And Mr. Lee looked at him with a faint trace of surprise in his eyes, as if no one had ever said such a thing to him before. And he said in a low voice, "Why would anyone want to hear my story?" Because Mr. Grant replied, "It is not just about loss, it is about love and loyalty and sacrifice. And these are things people need to be reminded of." And as he spoke, he felt the truth in his own words and realized that perhaps this night was not just about learning Mr. Lee's past, but also about changing his future, and his own as well. And Mr. Lee studied his face for a long moment before speaking again softly. "I do not know if I can talk about it more than I already have. It is like opening a wound." "Then let me help you carry it," Mr. Grant said, and the words came from somewhere deep inside him, without planning or thought. And they sat there in the quiet again, the clock ticking softly in the background, and the candle flame swaying slightly, as if moved by a breath neither of them could hear. And Mr. Lee finally gave a small nod, the kind of nod that means not agreement for today, but the beginning of trust. The night outside was darker now, the street almost empty, except for the occasional sound of a dog barking in the distance. And Mr. Grant glanced toward the window, knowing it was late, but not wanting to leave yet. And he said, "How about tomorrow morning we walk together to work, and I will introduce you properly to everyone as more than the janitor. I will tell them you are a man who has lived a life worth listening to." And Mr. Lee gave a faint, almost shy smile, the first smile Mr. Grant had seen on his face since they met, and it was small but real. They talked for a little while longer, not about the past, but about simple things: the weather, the books on the shelf, the flowers that used to grow outside the house. And slowly the heaviness in the room began to lift, just enough to let a little light in. And when Mr. Grant finally stood to leave, Mr. Lee walked him to the door and stood there in the doorway, the lamplight behind him casting a soft glow around his frame. And he said, "Thank you for listening and for seeing me." And Mr. Grant replied, "Thank you for letting me." As Mr. Grant stepped out into the cool night air, he looked back once and saw Mr. Lee still standing there, his hand resting on the doorframe, and for the first time the man did not look entirely alone. And the walk back to his car felt different, lighter, somehow, as if carrying someone else's story had made his own steps less heavy. And he knew this was not the end of the story, it was just the first time it had been told to someone else. The next morning the sun rose soft and golden over the city, and when Mr. Grant arrived outside the small house, Mr. Lee was already waiting, his old coat buttoned neatly, his small bag in hand, and they walked together toward the bus stop, side by side, their steps matching without trying. And as they moved through the streets, people passed them, without knowing who they were or what they carried, but it did not matter, because now the story was shared. When they reached the office building, the workers arriving for the day glanced up in surprise to see the CEO walking in with the janitor, and Mr. Grant smiled at their puzzled looks and said in a voice that carried to those nearby, "This is Mr. Lee. He has been with us for years, and there is much more to him than you know." And as they entered the lobby side by side, the quiet respect in Mr. Grant's tone made some of them look at Mr. Lee differently. For Mr. Lee it was a small step, but it was the first step toward something new. And as he walked through the lobby with his head a little higher, the image of his son's smile came to him and stayed with him like a light he could carry and perhaps one day share more openly. And for the first time in many years, he felt like he was not walking entirely alone.